I didn't expect it, but I knew the moment my daughter said, "You're too old to travel with us, Grandma, just watch the house," something inside me broke. It wasn't the sound of a bone snapping or glass shattering. It was a quieter, more profound kind of fracture, the kind that happens deep within the spirit when a truth you've long ignored finally crystallizes into a sharp, undeniable point. The words themselves, delivered with the casual thoughtlessness of a swat at a fly, weren't even the worst part. It was the easy assumption behind them, that my life had shrunk to fit the dimensions of their needs, that my purpose was now to be a placeholder, a security system with a heartbeat. I was the keeper of the hearth, but never a guest at the feast. The scene is etched into my memory with the painful clarity of a fresh wound. It was a Tuesday morning in early June, the kind of day that promises summer, all bright sun and the sweet, cloying scent of the honeysuckle I'd so carefully trained over the back fence. The air in my kitchen, usually my sanctuary, was thick with a strange mixture of smells, the ghost of the sourdough bread I'd woken at 5 to bake for them, the sharp citrus of my granddaughter Lily's sunscreen, and the faint, acrid scent of my son-in-law, Mark's, nervous sweat as he triple-checked his travel wallet. They were a whirlwind of frantic energy, a storm of suitcases and whispered anxieties about flight times and hotel confirmations. Lily, all of 8 years old with my late husband's bright blue eyes, danced around the living room, her laughter a series of bright, tinkling bells that used to be the soundtrack to my joy. Now, they felt like the chimes on a shop door, signaling another customer leaving me behind. I was sitting at the oak table my husband, Tom, had built with his own 2 hands, a relic from a life that felt increasingly like someone else's story. My knitting, a soft, gray blanket intended for Lily, lay limp in my lap, the needles cold and still. I was a fixture, as much a part of the house's inventory as the grandfather clock in the hall or the slightly faded floral sofa. The phone call was the final nail. My daughter, Sarah, was upstairs, her voice a tense, high-pitched hum as she coordinated some last-minute detail. I could hear snippets of her conversation, something about confirming a car rental. I had assumed, with the foolish optimism of a mother, that my ticket was booked, my bag was to be packed. I had envisioned seeing the ocean through Lily's eyes, building sandcastles and feeling the warm spray on my face. For weeks, I had been dropping hints, talking about a documentary I'd seen on the coastal towns of Maine, mentioning how I'd always wanted to try a real lobster roll. They had smiled and nodded, the way you do at a child babbling about fantasies. I see that now. They were never listening, they were just waiting for me to finish so the real conversation could continue. When Sarah came downstairs, her face was flushed, her phone pressed to her ear as she ended the call. She didn't look at me, not directly. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the overflowing laundry basket, the pile of mail on the counter, the half-packed cooler on the floor. Her focus was on the logistics of her departure, and I was just another item on her mental checklist. "Okay, Mom," she said, her voice brisk, businesslike. "We're all set. The flight's on time. We'll be gone for 10 days. She finally turned to me, a tight, practiced smile on her lips. It was the smile she used for PTA meetings and difficult clients. It wasn't the smile of a daughter. "The emergency numbers are on the fridge. Water the plants every other day, please. And don't forget to bring in the mail." I opened my mouth to ask, the question a hopeful, fragile bird in my throat. "What about my—" But she cut me off, her hand held up in a gesture of preemptive dismissal. She'd already moved on. That's when Mark, bless his tactless heart, chimed in from the doorway. He was wrestling with a suitcase that looked heavy enough to contain a small car. "Sarah tried to find a way, Rose," he said, grunting with effort. "It's just the pace of this trip, all the hiking and early mornings. It would be too much." "Too much for whom?" I wanted to scream. "For me, or for you to have to accommodate me?" Then came the final, devastating blow from Sarah. She must have seen the hope draining from my face, the silent question still hanging in the air. She sighed, a sound of pure exasperation, as if my unspoken desire was an immense burden. She walked over, placed a fleeting, papery kiss on my cheek that felt more like an erasure than an affection. "You're too old to travel with us, Grandma," she said, her voice softening into a tone of patronizing pity she probably thought was kindness. "It's for the best. You'll be more comfortable here. Just watch the house. Just watch the house." The words echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of the room. Lily had stopped dancing. Mark froze in the doorway. It was as if the world had paused to let the cruelty of the statement land with its full, crushing weight. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a utility. A house sitter. An unpaid guardian of their possessions while they went off to create memories without me. The bread I'd baked sat on the counter, a testament to my love, now feeling like a pathetic offering to gods who had no use for it. The gray blanket in my lap suddenly seemed like a shroud. I looked at my hands, at the wrinkled skin and the prominent veins that mapped a lifetime of work, of love, of sacrifice. These hands had changed their diapers, soothed their fevers, baked their birthday cakes, and held them tight through every storm. Now, they were deemed too old, too slow, too inconvenient. Something inside me didn't just break, it detonated. It was a silent, internal explosion of grief, rage, and a terrifying, liberating clarity. I nodded slowly, my face a mask of serene calm I did not feel. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice unnaturally steady. "You all go have a wonderful time." They took my acquiescence as agreement, as understanding. They didn't see the revolution beginning behind my eyes. They saw the quiet, compliant mother and grandmother they had always known. They had no idea that the woman they were leaving behind to watch the house would not be the same one they found upon their return. As they bustled out the door, a chorus of cheerful goodbyes trailing behind them, I didn't move. I listened to the car engine start, to the sound of their laughter fading down the street. The silence that descended wasn't empty. It was charged, humming with the force of a lifetime of suppressed feelings. I looked around the kitchen, at the pristine counters and the waiting plants. For the first time, it didn't feel like my home. It felt like a cage, a very comfortable, well-appointed cage I had unknowingly helped to build. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone and set my soul on fire, that I had to find the key. The slam of the car door was a punctuation mark at the end of a long, painful chapter of my life. I sat at that oak table for what felt like an eternity, the silence in the house pressing in on me, amplifying the roaring in my ears. It was the sound of my own blood, my own life force, suddenly demanding to be heard. The smell of the bread I had baked for them still hung in the air, but now it seemed to mock me, a sweet scent of servitude. With a slow, deliberate motion, I stood up, walked to the counter, picked up the loaf, and dropped it into the trash can. The soft thud it made as it hit the bottom was surprisingly satisfying. It was a small act, a petty rebellion no one would ever see, but it was a beginning. I looked at the list of emergency numbers on the refrigerator, held there by a smiling cartoon magnet. My daughter's neat, efficient handwriting stared back at me. Dr. Miller. Poison control. Neighbor Dave. My name wasn't on the list. I was the one who was supposed to make the calls, not the one who might need help. I was the failsafe, the background process that keeps the system running. I plucked the list from the fridge, folded it neatly in half, and then in half again, and tucked it away in a drawer I rarely opened. I would not be their emergency contact this week. Let them figure it out. The weight of their expectations, a cloak I had worn for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't my own skin, began to feel impossibly heavy. I felt a sudden, desperate need to shed it, to stand in the sun and feel its warmth on my own terms. The quiet of the house was no longer a gentle hush, it was a smothering blanket of neglect. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had always brought me comfort, now seemed to be counting down the moments of my life I was wasting. Each tick was a word: alone, alone, alone. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own home. I saw the indentations on the sofa where they had sat, the stray sock Lily had left behind, the faint scent of Mark's cologne lingering in the air. These were not signs of a loving family's presence, They were the artifacts of their departure, the detritus of a life I was merely adjacent to. For years, I had curated this house as a shrine to them. Every photograph on the mantelpiece, every piece of Lily's artwork on the refrigerator, every book on the shelves was chosen to reflect their tastes, their accomplishments, their lives. Where was I in all of this? There was a single, faded photograph of me and Tom on our wedding day, tucked away on a side table, a relic of a woman who no longer existed. That woman had dreams, ambitions. She wanted to be an art historian, to walk the halls of the Uffizi in Florence, to see the Mona Lisa's smile for herself. That woman had been systematically erased, replaced by Mom, then Grandma, titles that felt less like terms of endearment and more like job descriptions. The isolation deepened with every passing hour. I tried to busy myself with the tasks Sarah had assigned me. I watered the plants, their leaves drooping as if in sympathy with my own spirit. I sorted the mail, a pile of bills addressed to Sarah and Mark, catalogs for things they wanted, magazines they would read. Nothing for Rose. It was as if I had become invisible, a non-entity in my own mailing address. I found myself wandering from room to room, picking up objects and putting them down again, searching for something I couldn't name. I was searching for myself. I would catch my reflection in a window or a darkened television screen and for a moment, I wouldn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her hair was grayer than I remembered, her shoulders stooped with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. There were lines around her eyes that weren't just from laughter, they were from years of silent worry and unshed tears. Was this all that was left of me? A caretaker for an empty house? The nights were the worst. The silence became a living thing, breathing in the darkness, whispering all my fears. I would lie in bed, the sheets cold on one side where Tom used to be, and I would think about all the times I had put my own needs on the back burner. The trip to Paris we had planned for our 25th anniversary that was cancelled because Mark lost his job and they needed money to tide them over. The pottery class I'd wanted to take that I'd postponed indefinitely because Sarah needed a full-time babysitter for Lily after she went back to work. The book club I'd dropped out of because its meeting time clashed with Lily's soccer practice. Each sacrifice had felt necessary at the time, a small price to pay for the happiness of my family. But now, alone in the echoing silence, I could see that I had paid with the currency of my own life, and my account was nearly overdrawn. I began to question everything. Was my love for them conditional on my usefulness? Had they ever truly seen me, the woman behind the roles I played? The sting of their rejection wasn't just about a missed vacation. It was about a lifetime of being taken for granted, of being the bedrock on which they built their lives without ever once checking to see if the foundation was cracking. My self-worth, which I had always mistakenly tethered to their approval, began to crumble. I felt like a discarded toy, loved and played with until something newer and more exciting came along. The house, my beautiful, cozy home, started to feel like a prison. The walls, adorned with their memories, seemed to be closing in on me. I realized with a sickening lurch that I had no life of my own. My friendships had withered from neglect, my hobbies had been abandoned, my dreams had been packed away in the attic of my mind like old clothes. I had become utterly dependent on them, not for financial support, but for a sense of purpose. And now that they had so casually withdrawn that purpose, I was left with nothing. One afternoon, overcome with a profound sense of despair, I sank onto the floor of the living room, my back against the sofa, and I wept. I cried for the young woman I had been, for the dreams she had let go of. I cried for the years of silent sacrifice that had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. I cried for the lonely old woman I had become. The tears were a torrent, a flood of pent-up grief and anger that I had held back for far too long. As I sat there, sobbing in the quiet house, something shifted. The tears were not just of sorrow, they were of rage. A hot, cleansing anger began to burn through the fog of my despair. How dare they? How dare they reduce me to this? A fire was lit in the cold, empty rooms of my heart. It was a small, flickering flame, but it was enough. It was the first spark of a rebellion that would change everything. The silence of the house no longer felt like a void. It felt like a canvas, waiting for me to paint a new picture. I got up from the floor, my knees aching, my face swollen, but my spirit strangely lighter. I walked to the window and looked out at the world, at the neighbors mowing their lawns, at the children playing in the street. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't see it as something happening outside of me. I saw it as something I could be a part of. The weight of silence had been crushing, but it had also forced me to listen to the one voice I had been ignoring for decades, my own. And it was telling me, in no uncertain terms, that it was time for a change. I didn't know what that change would be, or how I would make it happen. But as I stood there, the afternoon sun warming my face, I knew one thing for sure. The era of Silent Rose was over. I went to the phone and looked up the number for a local travel agency. My hand hovered over the keypad, a tremor of fear and excitement running through me. The old Rose would have backed away, chastising herself for such a foolish, selfish thought. But the new Rose, the one forged in the crucible of this week's painful solitude, pressed the numbers with a firm, steady hand. A cheerful voice answered on the other end. "Citywide travel, how can I help you?" I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I'd like to book a trip." The echoes of sacrifice are the ghosts that haunt the quietest corners of a woman's life. They don't rattle chains or slam doors, they whisper in the rustle of a dress you never got to wear, in the scent of a paint you never got to use, in the silence where a song you wanted to learn should be. My house was full of these ghosts, spectral monuments to the life I had deferred. As I sat with the travel brochures spread across the oak table, glossy pages showcasing turquoise waters and ancient cities that seemed a world away, my mind kept drifting back, not in gentle nostalgia, but with the sharp, investigative focus of a detective examining a cold case. The case of the disappearing woman, me. My first major sacrifice had felt like a noble choice at the time, a testament to my love for Tom. I had been 2 years into my art history degree, completely enthralled by the Italian Renaissance, when he got the promotion. It required a move, a relocation from the bustling university city we lived into a quiet, suburban town where the main employer was a plastics factory. "It's the opportunity of a lifetime, Rosie," he'd said, his eyes shining with an ambition that I loved. "It'll set us up for life." He promised I could finish my degree at the local community college. But the local college's art department consisted of one overworked professor and a handful of evening classes in macrame and watercolor for beginners. The dream of Florence and the Uffizi was quietly shelved. We needed the money, and his career took precedence. I told myself it was a temporary detour. But detours have a way of becoming the main road. Then came Sarah. The moment I held her in my arms, my world reoriented around her tiny, perfect form. My shelved dreams were packed away more securely, buried under layers of diapers, PTA meetings, and bake sales. My role as mother became my entire identity. I poured all my creative energy, all my intellectual curiosity, into raising a smart, confident daughter. I taught her about art, taking her to every museum within a 100-mile radius. I read her the classics, instilling in her a love of literature that eventually led her to a successful career as an editor. I was the silent partner in her success, the invisible scaffolding that allowed her to build her own life. I never once begrudged her this. Seeing her thrive was my greatest joy. But I see now that in my dedication to nurturing her flame, I allowed my own to dwindle to a pilot light. The sacrifices became a habit, an ingrained reflex. When Tom fell ill, his long, slow decline consumed my 40s. I became his nurse, his advocate, his constant companion. My world shrank to the size of his sickbed. Our savings, which we'd earmarked for the travel we always planned to do someday, were drained by medical bills and caregiver expenses. Friends stopped calling, unsure of what to say. My life was a monotonous cycle of appointments, medications, and quiet, fearful nights. I did it out of love, a deep and abiding love for the man I had married. But after he was gone, and the flurry of condolences and casseroles subsided, I found myself in a silence that was even more profound than the one I was currently experiencing. I was a widow at 55, with a daughter who was building her own family and a life that felt like an empty stage after the play had ended. That's when Sarah and Mark had moved back to town. They'd bought a house just a few blocks away, and for a while, it felt like a new beginning. The birth of Lily was a splash of vibrant color in my monochrome world. I threw myself into the role of grandma with the same all-consuming energy I had devoted to being a mother. I was the default babysitter, the emergency contact, the baker of birthday cakes, and the weaver of Halloween costumes. I did it gladly, joyfully. I was needed again. My purpose was restored. But there's a difference between being needed and being valued. I was convenient. I was reliable. I was free. They built their lives, their careers, their social circles, around the comforting certainty that I would always be there to pick up the slack. A dinner party on a Friday night? Mom can watch Lily. A weekend getaway? Mom will be happy to have her. A demanding project at work that required late nights? Don't worry, Mom's got it. I was the foundation of their carefully constructed life. But foundations are, by their nature, underground. Unseen. I began to question why my sacrifices were never enough. I had given them my time, my energy, my dreams, my money. I had poured myself out like a pitcher of water, and yet their cups never seemed to overflow with gratitude. It was simply expected. My willingness to give was interpreted not as generosity, but as an absence of my own needs. The weight of these past decisions pressed heavily on my heart. Had I taught them to treat me this way? In my eagerness to be the perfect mother and grandmother, had I inadvertently erased myself? Had I modeled for my own daughter that a woman's worth is measured by the totality of her self-abnegation? The glossy picture of the Amalfi Coast on the brochure seemed to mock me. A woman who looked to be about my age was laughing, her face turned to the sun, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked free. She looked like she belonged to herself. The conflict rising in me was a quiet, churning thing. It was the woman I was raised to be, the dutiful wife, the selfless mother, the accommodating grandmother, at war with the woman who was screaming to be born, the one who wanted to stand on an Italian balcony and feel the sun on her own face. I thought of a specific moment a few years ago. It was my 70th birthday. Sarah and Mark had insisted on throwing me a party. I was touched, genuinely moved. They rented a small room at a local restaurant, invited a few of my remaining friends and some of their own. I spent the weeks beforehand in a state of happy anticipation. I bought a new dress, a lovely silk floral that made me feel elegant. But when I arrived, I saw that the party wasn't really for me. The music was loud, contemporary pop that gave me a headache. The food was a selection of trendy appetizers I couldn't pronounce. The guests were mostly Sarah and Mark's friends, who milled around making small talk with me for a polite 2 minutes before turning back to their own conversations. Sarah gave a speech, full of loving platitudes about what a wonderful mother and grandmother I was, how they couldn't manage without me. It was meant to be a tribute, but it felt like a job performance review. The gift they gave me was a digital photo frame, preloaded with hundreds of pictures of them and Lily. There were only a handful of me, usually in the background, a smiling but peripheral figure. I remember sitting there, in my beautiful new dress, feeling like a ghost at my own party. They were celebrating my role in their lives, not my existence as a person. The echoes of that night reverberated in the present moment. I saw the pattern so clearly now. My life had been a series of supporting roles, and I had never once auditioned for the lead. I had been waiting patiently in the wings, hoping someone would call my name, not realizing that I was the only one with the power to put myself on stage. I looked down at the brochures again. The woman on the Amalfi Coast was still laughing. I picked up the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. I dialed the travel agency again. "Hello, Citywide Travel," the cheerful voice said. "Yes, it's Rose again," I replied, my own voice shaking slightly. "I was looking at your brochure for Italy. The 10-day tour of Rome, Florence, and the Amalfi Coast. That's one of our most popular trips. A wonderful choice. When were you thinking of traveling? She asked. I took a deep breath. Next week, I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Next week? That's quite spontaneous. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. Yes, I said. It is. The ghost of the girl who dreamed of the Uffizi smiled with me. Book it, I said, the words feeling like the most profound declaration of independence I had ever uttered. The sacrifice was over. The echoes were fading, being replaced by the sound of a future I was finally claiming for myself. The days that followed my booking the trip were a strange cocktail of terror and exhilaration. Loneliness, which had been a suffocating blanket, was now a vast, open space, a prairie of possibility. The house was still quiet, but the silence had changed its tune. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of abandonment, but the calm, anticipatory quiet of a theater before the curtain rises. Yet, the specter of loneliness was a persistent one, a shadow that had grown long over decades. It was a creature of habit, and it didn't give up its territory easily. My days, which had once been structured around the needs of others, were now formless, stretching before me like an empty road. The simple chores I once performed as acts of love now felt like hollow motions. I watered the plants, not because Sarah had asked me to, but because I couldn't bear to let something living die of neglect. It felt too close to home. I baked, not for them, but for myself. I made a small batch of my favorite oatmeal raisin cookies, the kitchen filling with a warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and sugar. But when they were done, I sat at the table with a plate of 2 cookies and a glass of milk, and the solitude was a palpable presence at the table with me. I was used to the sounds of Lily chattering about her day, of Sarah and Mark coming through the door, tired and hungry. Eating alone felt unnatural, a confirmation of my isolation. The things I once cherished now felt like chores, stark reminders of a life that was no longer mine. My garden, my pride and joy, had become a source of anxiety. I would stand at the back door, looking at the vibrant blooms of the roses and the burgeoning tomato plants, and feel a profound sense of disconnection. It was a family garden, planted with the intention of making salads for summer barbecues, of cutting fresh flowers for the dining table where we would all gather. Now, it was just my garden. The thought of all those tomatoes ripening with no one to eat them filled me with a strange, aching sadness. Who was I, if not a provider? The silence of the house was a relentless adversary. It amplified every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator. I started leaving the television on all day, not to watch it, but just to have the sound of human voices in the house. It was a poor substitute for real companionship. In the evenings, I would sit in my armchair, the one Tom and I had picked out together, and try to read. But the words would blur on the page, my mind wandering back to the past, to the cacophony of a life filled with family. I missed the chaos. I missed the mess. I missed the feeling of being at the center of a bustling, loving universe. I had been so overwhelmed by it at times, so desperate for a moment of peace and quiet. Now that I had it, I found it unbearable. I tried calling Sarah one evening, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. The phone rang and rang before finally going to voicemail. "Hi, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice light and breezy. "It's Mom. Just calling to see how the trip is going. Hope you're all having a wonderful time. The house is fine. Everything's fine. Talk to you soon." The words "everything's fine" felt like a lie, a betrayal of the turmoil in my heart. She sent a text message a few hours later. "Having a blast. Lily loves the ocean. So glad you're holding down the fort." A picture was attached, Sarah, Mark, and Lily, grinning, tanned, and happy, with a brilliant blue ocean behind them. They looked beautiful. They looked complete. They looked like they didn't need me at all. I stared at the picture for a long time, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Holding down the fort. I wasn't a person, I was a function. A placeholder. The loneliness that followed that text was the most acute I had ever felt. It was a physical ache, a hollowness in my gut. I was forgotten. An afterthought. A convenience they were glad to have. The struggle was internal, a silent battle waged in the quiet rooms of my house. Part of me, the old, conditioned part, wanted to sink into the comfortable misery of victimhood. It was so easy to feel sorry for myself, to blame them, to wallow in the injustice of it all. But another part of me, the new, fragile part that had booked a ticket to Italy, refused to surrender. It was the part of me that had thrown the bread in the trash. It was the part of me that knew I deserved more. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the smiling faces on my phone, when I felt the lowest I had in years. The despair was a tide, pulling me under. I felt tears welling up, the familiar sting of self-pity. But then, my eyes landed on the travel brochure, still lying on the table. The woman on the cover was still laughing, still basking in the Italian sun. And I thought, no. I will not be this sad, lonely woman in a quiet house. I will not let their thoughtlessness define the final chapters of my life. I will not be a fort to be held down. I will be the adventurer who goes out to see the world. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went up to the attic, a place filled with dust and memories. I navigated through the stacks of old furniture and boxes of seasonal decorations until I found what I was looking for, my old suitcases. They were a matching set, a deep, beautiful burgundy, a wedding gift from my parents. They were covered in a thick layer of dust, relics from a life of deferred dreams. I dragged them down the rickety attic stairs, my heart pounding with a strange, triumphant rhythm. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning them, wiping away the years of neglect. As I polished the brass fittings and aired out the musty interior, I felt like I was tending to a neglected part of my own soul. This act, this simple preparation for a journey, was an act of defiance against the loneliness that threatened to consume me. I was no longer just waiting. I was preparing. I was moving forward. The loneliness was still there, a quiet hum in the background, but it no longer had the power to paralyze me. It was simply a condition, like the weather. And I knew, with a growing sense of certainty, that I was about to walk into the sunshine. The house was still quiet, but now, when I listened closely, I could hear the faint, thrilling whisper of adventure on the horizon. The attic had been more than just a storage space for dusty suitcases, it was a mausoleum of my forgotten self. In my search for the luggage, my hands had brushed against other artifacts of my pre-motherhood life. There was a box labeled college art, and inside, nestled in tissue paper, were charcoal sketches, academic papers with encouraging notes from professors, and a small, leather-bound diary. I brought the box downstairs, a sense of trepidation and curiosity warring within me. That evening, with a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, I opened the diary. The handwriting was mine, yet it felt like a stranger's, loopy, confident, full of youthful certainty. The pages were filled with passionate dissections of Caravaggio's use of chiaroscuro, excited ramblings about a future spent wandering the galleries of Europe, and declarations of intent. "I will not be a woman who lives a small life," I had written on the first page. The irony was a punch to the gut. Here I was, 72 years old, living the very definition of a small life, confined to a house and a role that had shrunk around me like a wool sweater in a hot dryer. But as I kept reading, something else happened. The initial pang of regret began to transform into a flicker of inspiration. That young woman, so full of fire and ambition, wasn't a stranger. She was still in here, buried under decades of casseroles and carpools. The diary was a map leading back to her. The next day, fueled by a restless energy, I did something I hadn't done in nearly 50 years. I drove to the local art supply store. The moment I walked in, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil hit me, a sensory key that unlocked a room in my memory I thought had been sealed forever. I felt a thrill, a giddiness that was entirely foreign. I wandered the aisles, running my fingers over the rough texture of canvas, the smooth barrels of paintbrushes, the waxy tips of oil pastels. I was a child in a candy store. I didn't know what I was doing, but I felt a powerful, intuitive pull. I bought a small, spiral-bound sketchbook, a set of charcoal pencils, and an eraser. It wasn't much, but it felt monumental. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had received my dismissal, and I opened the sketchbook. For a long time, I just stared at the blank white page. It was intimidating, a pristine field of snow I was afraid to mar with a clumsy footprint. My internal critic, a voice that sounded suspiciously like my daughter Sarah in her most practical, no-nonsense tone, was loud and clear. "You don't know how to do this anymore. You're too old to learn. What's the point?" The conflict was fierce. The fear of failure, of proving my own inner critic right, was almost paralyzing. My hand hovered over the page, trembling slightly. I thought about the girl in the diary, the one who wasn't afraid to be bold, to make mistakes. I took a deep breath and pressed the charcoal to the paper. I decided to draw the first thing I saw, the sugar bowl on the table. My first lines were shaky, uncertain. The proportions were off, the shading was clumsy. It looked like a lopsided blob. The old me would have torn the page out, crumpled it into a tight ball of shame, and given up. But the woman who had booked a ticket to Italy looked at the lopsided blob and saw something else. She saw a start. She saw a mark made on a blank page, an act of creation in a life that had become about maintenance. I kept going. I filled the page with sketches of the sugar bowl, each one slightly less lopsided than the last. Then I drew the salt shaker, the vase of wilting flowers, my own hand. It was clumsy, rusty, and utterly exhilarating. I was stepping out of my comfort zone, a zone that had become a cage, and I was breathing a different kind of air. That small act of drawing opened a floodgate. The next day, I drove to the public library, a place I'd only visited to pick up books for Lily. This time, I went for myself. I bypassed the fiction shelves and went straight to the 700s, the arts section. I felt a familiar thrill as I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, their titles like old friends, Gardner's Art Through the Ages, The Lives of the Artists, The Shock of the New. I sat in a comfortable armchair in a sunlit corner and lost myself for hours in the world I had abandoned. I read about Artemisia Gentileschi, a female painter who had triumphed in a man's world, and I felt a surge of defiant kinship. I reacquainted myself with the Impressionists, who had broken all the rules to paint the world as they saw it. I was reconnecting with a part of myself I thought was long dead, and it was like finding a beloved piece of jewelry I assumed was lost forever. These small changes began to accumulate, creating a subtle but significant shift in my inner landscape. One afternoon, while tending to my now lonely garden, I looked up the number for a local community center I'd driven past 1,000 times. Their website listed a dizzying array of classes: pottery, creative writing, conversational Spanish, even yoga for seniors. The internal conflict flared again. "You'll be the oldest one there. You won't know anyone. You'll make a fool of yourself." But the voice of the adventurer, the one who was going to Italy, was growing stronger. "So what?" It answered back. I signed up for a 6-week introductory pottery class that met on Wednesday mornings. Walking into that class was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The room was filled with strangers, mostly women, of all ages. My hands were sweating, and my heart was doing a nervous little tap dance against my ribs. But the instructor, a kind-faced woman with clay under her fingernails, greeted me with a warm smile. And as I sat at the wheel, the lump of cold, wet clay spinning under my hands, something miraculous happened. The world outside the studio, the quiet house, the thoughtless daughter, the gnawing loneliness, it all faded away. There was only the clay, the wheel, and the challenge of centering this shapeless lump, of coaxing it into a form of my own choosing. It was a perfect metaphor for what I was trying to do with my own life. My first pot was a disaster, a wobbly, thick-walled thing that collapsed in on itself. But I laughed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed a deep, genuine belly laugh, not caring who heard. The woman next to me, whose name was Eleanor, laughed with me. My first one looked like a melted ashtray, she confided. And just like that, I wasn't alone. I had made a connection, however small. I was no longer just a grandmother or a house sitter. I was Rose, the beginner potter. I was Rose, the art lover. I was slowly, painstakingly, reclaiming the pieces of myself I had given away. The spark of self-discovery was becoming a steady flame, casting a warm, hopeful light on the path ahead. The pottery class with Eleanor became an anchor in my week. She was a retired history teacher, sharp and witty, with a laugh that could startle birds from trees. Like me, she was a widow, her children scattered across the country, busy with their own lives. We bonded over our lopsided pots and our shared experience of being women of a certain age navigating a world that often seemed determined to render us invisible. After class one day, we went for coffee at a little cafe next to the community center. It was the first time in years I'd gone for coffee with a friend, an activity so normal for most people, yet so revolutionary for me. You seem different these days, Rose, Eleanor said, stirring her cappuccino. When you first came to class, you were so tentative. Now you've got a spark. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. I'm trying something new, I said, a little shyly. Then, feeling a surge of courage, I confessed. I booked a trip to Italy. I leave in a few days. Eleanor's eyes widened, and then a huge grin spread across her face. Italy. Get out of town. Literally. That's fantastic. Her unreserved enthusiasm was like a balm to my soul. There was no, "Are you sure you should be traveling alone at your age?" No, "Who's going to watch the house?" Just pure, unadulterated excitement for me. "I've always wanted to go to Italy," she said, her voice turning wistful. "My husband, George, and we always talked about it. We had a jar where we saved our loose change. We called it our Rome Fund. We were going to go when he retired." She looked out the window, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "We never made it." Her words landed with a quiet resonance. The Rome Fund. Tom and I had our own version. It was an old shoebox in the back of his closet labeled "Someday." It was filled with travel brochures we'd collected over the years, dog-eared maps, and lists of places we wanted to see. Paris. London. The Grand Canyon. Someday. But someday was a thief. It stole your youth, your health, your opportunities, and in the end, it stole your partner, leaving you with a box of faded dreams. The conversation sparked something in me, a connection between my past and my future. That evening, I went to Tom's closet. It still smelled faintly of him, a mixture of cedar and his favorite Old Spice aftershave. I reached to the back of the top shelf and there it was, the Someday shoebox. I sat on our bed and lifted the lid. Inside were the ghosts of our shared ambitions. A brochure for a cruise to Alaska, its pictures of glaciers and whales now faded. A map of Ireland with driving routes circled in red ink. And at the very bottom, a thin, almost brittle pamphlet for a tour of Italy, the very same one I had just booked. I had completely forgotten it was there. It felt like a sign, a blessing from a life I thought was over. Seeing it, holding it in my hands, didn't make me sad. It made me determined. Tom didn't get to have his someday. But I was still here. I could have it for both of us. The forgotten dream wasn't just mine, it was ours. And I would be the one to finally live it. But as the departure date drew closer, a new conflict began to brew, a cold tide of fear and self-doubt that threatened to extinguish my newfound flame. The voice of my conditioning, the voice of societal expectation, grew louder. "You're 72 years old, Rose. What are you thinking? Traveling alone to a foreign country where you don't speak the language? It's reckless. It's selfish." The fear of being too old, too frail, too vulnerable, was a powerful deterrent. I imagined myself lost in the crowded streets of Rome, unable to ask for directions. I pictured myself falling on the cobblestones of Florence, alone and helpless. I thought about the logistics, the heavy luggage, the confusing train schedules, the strange food. The sheer effort of it all seemed overwhelming. One night, I almost called the travel agency to cancel. My hand was on the phone, my heart pounding with anxiety. It would be so easy to retreat, to sink back into the familiar comfort of my quiet house, my predictable routine. No one would blame me. In fact, they would probably be relieved. "See?" they would say. "We told you it was too much for her." But then, a sense of rebellion began to rise in me, hot and fierce. It was the same rebellion that had made me throw the bread in the trash. Why not me? Why should my age be a barrier to joy, to adventure, to life itself? Why was a man of 72 who goes on a solo trip seen as a rugged individualist, while a woman of the same age is seen as foolish or irresponsible? I had spent my entire life being responsible, being sensible, being selfless. I had earned the right to be a little reckless. I had earned the right to be selfish. I got up from the bed, leaving the shoebox of dreams open, and walked to the full-length mirror on the closet door. I looked at myself, really looked. I saw the silver hair, the wrinkles, the slight stoop in my shoulders. But I also saw the strength in my eyes, a resilience that had been forged in the fires of love and loss. I had survived grief. I had raised a child. I had cared for a dying husband. I could certainly handle a plate of pasta in a foreign country. "You can do this, Rose," I said to my reflection, my voice a whisper in the quiet room. The woman in the mirror nodded back, her expression one of grim determination. The forgotten dream was no longer a wistful fantasy. It was a challenge. It was a promise I was making to the young girl who had filled a diary with her ambitions, to the young wife who had packed them away, and to the old woman who was finally ready to live. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. But now, it was accompanied by something else, something more powerful, the unshakable conviction that I was worthy of this adventure. The days leading up to my departure were a whirlwind of practical preparations that felt like profound acts of rebellion. Packing was no longer just about choosing clothes, it was about curating a new identity. I bypassed the sensible, beige cardigans and orthopedic-looking walking shoes that had become my uniform. Instead, I packed the silk floral dress from my ill-fated birthday party. I bought a new pair of stylish, comfortable sandals, a brightly colored scarf, and a pair of chic sunglasses. I was not packing for Grandma, I was packing for Rose. Each item that went into my burgundy suitcase was a declaration of intent. I was stepping into the world for myself, and I was going to look the part. The most difficult task, however, was not packing my suitcase, but preparing for the conversation I knew I had to have. My family was due back the day before my flight to Rome. For years, my life had been an open book to them, my time and resources theirs to command. This trip was the first secret I had kept, the first boundary I was preparing to draw. It was terrifying. The internal conflict was a raging storm. The deeply ingrained habit of seeking their approval, of avoiding conflict at all costs, was at war with my new, fierce desire for autonomy. I rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times, my lines changing from angry and accusatory to apologetic and weak. Finally, I settled on a tone I hoped I could achieve, calm, firm, and non-negotiable. I was not asking for permission. I was making a statement. The day of their return, the house felt charged with a nervous energy that was all my own. I heard their car pull into the driveway, the familiar sounds of doors slamming and Lily's excited chatter. My heart hammered against my ribs. The front door opened, and they spilled into the entryway, tanned and laden with souvenirs, smelling of sunshine and airplane air. "Mom. We're home," Sarah called out, her voice cheerful. "The house looks great. Thanks so much for everything." They bustled around me, a flurry of activity and stories about their trip. Lily threw her arms around my legs, and I hugged her tight, the familiar love for her a sharp, sweet ache in my chest. Mark was already checking the mail, Sarah was scanning the kitchen counters, her mind already back to the logistics of her life. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and I was expected to slot back into my old role, the silent, accommodating fixture in the background. They barely seemed to notice the burgundy suitcase standing sentinel by the front door. We sat in the living room, and they showed me their pictures, Lily narrating each one with breathless excitement. I smiled and nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I was waiting for the right moment, the right opening to detonate the carefully constructed reality of our relationship. The moment came when Sarah, scrolling through her phone, said, "Oh, the Millers are having their annual barbecue on Saturday. I told them we'd come. You can watch Lily for us, right?" And there it was. The casual assumption. The easy appropriation of my time. The seamless return to the status quo. I took a deep breath. The storm inside me stilled, replaced by a strange, icy calm. "Actually," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I expected. "I can't." Sarah looked up from her phone, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Oh. Do you have plans?" "Yes," I said. "I do." All three of them were looking at me now, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and confusion. This was new territory. My life had never before included plans that superseded theirs. "Well, what is it?" Mark asked, a hint of impatience in his tone. I stood up and walked over to my suitcase. I placed my hand on the handle, the smooth, cool leather grounding me. "I'm going on a trip," I said. Silence. It was a thick, uncomprehending silence. Lily was the first to break it. "A trip, Grandma? Where are you going?" "I'm going to Italy," I said, looking directly at Sarah. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked from my face to the suitcase and back again, the pieces slowly clicking into place in her mind. The color drained from her face. "Italy? By yourself? When did you decide this?" "I decided it the day you left," I said, my voice even, devoid of accusation. I let the statement hang in the air, letting her connect the dots. Her expression shifted from shock to a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. "But you can't," she stammered. "Who's going to? I mean, it's not safe. You're—" She trailed off, but I knew the word she was choking on. "Old. I am 72 years old," I said, finishing her thought for her. "I am not made of glass. And I am perfectly capable of traveling on my own." Mark stepped in, playing the role of the reasonable patriarch. "Rose, be sensible. This is a big undertaking. Did you even think this through? The cost, the logistics. It's all taken care of," I said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "My flight leaves tomorrow morning." The finality of my statement landed like a thunderclap. Sarah stared at me, her eyes filled with a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite decipher: anger, hurt, confusion, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of respect. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small. "Why didn't you tell us?" And that was the moment of truth. The moment to finally say the words that had been buried for so long. I looked at my daughter, the child I had poured my entire life into, and I spoke the hardest, most liberating truth I had ever uttered. "Because my life is not a subsidiary of yours, Sarah," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "My time is not a resource for you to manage. My dreams are not something I need to clear with your schedule." I paused, letting the words sink in. "I have spent my entire life watching over things. Your childhood, your home, your daughter. And I have loved every minute of it. But I am not just here to watch the house anymore." Her face crumpled, the carefully constructed composure of the successful editor and competent mother falling away to reveal the bewildered child underneath. "But we need you," she whispered. "I know you do," I said, and for the first time, I allowed a note of sadness into my voice. "But I need me more." I turned and walked towards the door, pulling my burgundy suitcase behind me. The wheels made a soft, rumbling sound on the hardwood floor, the sound of a new beginning. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I might falter. This was not an act of abandonment. It was an act of reclamation. I was finally, after a lifetime of waiting, stepping into the world for myself, and the road to freedom lay just beyond the front door. The airport was a symphony of controlled chaos, a river of humanity flowing in a dozen different directions. For a moment, standing at the entrance to the international terminal, a wave of panic washed over me. The sheer scale of it, The noise, the signs in multiple languages, it was overwhelming. The old Rose would have retreated, hailed a cab, and returned to the quiet safety of her house. But the woman who had walked out that door with her burgundy suitcase took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the handle, and plunged into the current. My first solo trip was not a seamless, perfect adventure movie. It was messy, challenging, and utterly, breathtakingly real. My first major hurdle was navigating the Rome Fiumicino airport. My flight had been delayed, and I arrived late at night, exhausted and disoriented. The signs in Italian seemed to blur together, and the crush of people was dizzying. I felt a familiar pang of fear, the voice of doubt whispering in my ear, "See? You can't do this." But then I remembered the hours I had spent in the library, poring over maps and guidebooks. I had prepared for this. I found a quiet corner, took out my pre-printed instructions, and slowly, methodically, found my way to the official taxi stand, avoiding the aggressive touts who preyed on weary travelers. Getting into that taxi, giving the driver the address of my small hotel near the Campo de Fiori, felt like a monumental victory. Rome was a glorious assault on the senses. It was a city that wore its history like a comfortable old coat, where ancient ruins stood casually next to bustling cafes. The first few days, I was a tourist, dutifully ticking off the landmarks. I threw a coin in the Trevi fountain, my wish not for a new love, but for continued courage. I stood in the heart of the Colosseum, dwarfed by its scale, imagining the roar of the crowds, and felt a profound sense of my own small but significant place in the long continuum of human experience. But I also faced moments of acute doubt. Eating alone in a city of lovers and large, boisterous families was hard. I would sit at a small table for one, feeling the weight of my solitude, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. One evening, sitting in a beautiful piazza, watching families share laughter and plates of pasta, a wave of homesickness and regret washed over me so powerfully it almost brought me to tears. I missed Lily. I even missed the familiar, frustrating dynamic with Sarah. Was this freedom just another word for loneliness? But then, something would happen to pull me back. A kind shopkeeper would patiently help me decipher a label. A street musician would play a hauntingly beautiful melody on his violin. I would turn a corner and be confronted with a breathtaking piece of art, a Bernini sculpture or a hidden courtyard garden, and the world would open up again. I learned to be my own companion. I started a travel journal, filling its pages with sketches and observations, just as I had in my college diary. I took myself out for gelato, savoring every spoonful without the need to share. I discovered that my own company could be quite enjoyable. The turning point came in Florence. I had booked a ticket to the Uffizi Gallery months in advance, the fulfillment of a 50-year-old dream. Walking into those hallowed halls, I felt a sense of reverence, of coming home. I stood before Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, a painting I had only ever seen in books, and I was moved to tears. It was more beautiful, more ethereal, more perfect than I could have ever imagined. I was no longer just looking at art, I was experiencing it, living it. I spent the entire day in that gallery, until my feet ached and my soul was full. That afternoon, I sat in a cafe overlooking the Ponte Vecchio, sketching the bridge in my journal. An elderly Italian gentleman at the next table, impeccably dressed in a linen suit, leaned over. "Signora," he said, with a warm, crinkling smile. "You have the eye of an artist." We struck up a conversation. His name was Marco, and he was a retired professor of architecture. We talked for over an hour, about Brunelleschi's tomb, about the quality of the light in Tuscany, about the joy of seeing the world with fresh eyes. He didn't ask about my husband or my children. He didn't treat me like a fragile old woman. He treated me like an interesting person, a peer. He saw me not as a grandmother, but as Rose. This encounter, and others like it, began to reshape my understanding of the world and my place in it. I met a group of Australian women on a train to the Amalfi Coast, and we shared a bottle of wine and raucous laughter. I had a long conversation with a young backpacker from Japan about our favorite books. I was meeting people who saw me for who I was in that moment, not for the roles I had played my whole life. They saw a woman with wisdom in her eyes and a new, adventurous spirit. They treated me with a respect and admiration I hadn't realized I was starving for. My journey showed me that age was not a limitation, but a gift. I had the wisdom to appreciate the art, the patience to savor the quiet moments, and the life experience to connect with people on a deeper level. The world was not a scary, dangerous place for a woman my age. It was a vast, beautiful, and welcoming place, if you had the courage to step into it. One of my last days was spent on a boat tour of the island of Capri. As the boat cut through the impossibly blue water, the sun warm on my skin, a feeling of profound peace settled over me. I looked at the stunning coastline, the vibrant flowers clinging to the cliffs, and I felt a sense of belonging not to a house or a family, but to the world itself. I was no longer a discarded heart. I was a traveler, an artist, an adventurer. The road to freedom hadn't been a straight, easy path. It had been paved with moments of fear and doubt. But with every step, I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. I had come to Italy to see the art, but I had ended up discovering a masterpiece I had overlooked for far too long, myself. My journey through Italy was as much internal as it was external. The physical distance from my family created an emotional space that was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time, our communication was on my terms. I was the one who was busy, who was having adventures, who had to be reached across time zones. The dynamic had been completely inverted. I chose not to call them for the first week. I needed to untether myself completely, to prove to myself that I could exist without their validation or their drama. I sent a single, brief email a few days after I arrived safely in Rome. Everything is beautiful. Hope you are all well. Love, Mom. It was factual, warm, but distant. It offered no openings for guilt or obligation. The response from Sarah came almost immediately, a frantic jumble of texts and a voicemail. Mom, where are you? Are you okay? Why didn't you call? We were worried sick. Please call me as soon as you get this. The tone was a familiar cocktail of feigned concern and underlying control. The old me would have been racked with guilt, would have rushed to reassure her, to apologize for causing her worry. The new me, sitting at a cafe in the Piazza Navona with a cappuccino and my sketchbook, simply read the message, took a sip of my coffee, and went back to drawing Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers. I was not responsible for her anxiety. I had told her I would be fine, and I was. Her worry was a product of her own need to be in control, not my actions. I waited until the next day to reply, another brief email. So sorry to have worried you. As I said, I'm perfectly fine. Rome is magnificent. I'm quite busy, but I'll try to call in a few days. Don't worry about me. I was reclaiming my voice, one calm, firm sentence at a time. The real shift happened when I sent them a picture. It was a photo I'd asked a friendly stranger to take of me on the Amalfi Coast. In it, I'm standing on a balcony overlooking the sea, the sun setting behind me, casting a golden glow. I'm wearing a brightly colored scarf, my hair is windswept, and I have a huge, genuine smile on my face. I look happy. I look free. I sent it with a simple caption, "Greetings from Positano." This picture, I later learned, was the catalyst. It wasn't a picture of Grandma. It was a picture of Rose, a vibrant woman living her life to the fullest. It was irrefutable proof that I was not just surviving without them, I was thriving. The phone calls started to change. The frantic demands to know where I was were replaced with hesitant questions about what I was seeing. Sarah, in particular, seemed to be struggling. Our first real conversation was strained. "It looks nice," she said, her voice tight, after I described the Uffizi. Are you sure you're managing okay with the money?" It was a clumsy attempt to reassert her old role as the competent, concerned daughter managing her aging parent. "I'm managing just fine, dear," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I'm a resourceful woman. I've been managing my own life for a very long time." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had never spoken to her like that before. I had always allowed her to take the lead, to treat me as someone who needed her guidance. The climactic confrontation, however, happened via a video call a few days before I was due to fly home. I was sitting on the terrace of my small hotel in Sorrento, the scent of lemons in the air. They were all huddled around a screen in their living room back home. Sarah's face was a mask of confusion and hurt. "I still don't understand why you had to do this, Mom," she began, launching into the argument I knew was coming. "To just leave like that, without a word. It was so selfish." I let her speak, let her vent her frustration and her sense of betrayal. The old me would have interrupted, defended, argued. The new me listened patiently. When she finally wound down, her anger spent, I took a breath. "I understand why you feel that way," I began, my voice calm. "I was not going to fight. I was going to explain. But I need you to understand something from my side. For my entire adult life, my world has revolved around the needs of others. First Tom, then you, then Lily. And I did it with all my heart, Sarah. But somewhere along the way, I disappeared. I don't think you ever did it intentionally, but you and Mark and even Lily started to see me not as a person, but as a role. The grandma. The babysitter. The house sitter." I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. I pressed on. "The moment you told me I was too old to go to Maine, that I should just stay home and watch the house. It broke my heart, but it also woke me up. I realized that if I wanted to have a life of my own, I was the only one who could make it happen. I couldn't wait for you to grant me permission." Tears were welling in her eyes now. "But we love you," she whispered. "I know you do," I said, and my own voice cracked with emotion. "But love has to be accompanied by respect. And you weren't respecting me, Sarah. You weren't seeing me. This trip wasn't about running away from you. It was about running towards myself." I paused, letting the truth of my words settle in the space between us. Mark was silent, looking down at his hands. Even Lily was quiet, watching her mother with wide, uncertain eyes. "I'm not asking you to apologize," I continued. "I'm asking you to see me. All of me, not just the part of me that is useful to you. I am your mother, but I am also Rose. And Rose is a woman who loves art, and travel, and learning new things. And she's not going to be put on a shelf anymore." There was a long, heavy silence. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. She looked at her husband, then at her daughter, and then back at me, her image pixelated on my screen thousands of miles away. "You're right," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I never saw it that way. It wasn't a perfect, movie script apology. It was fragile, and hesitant, and born of a painful, dawning awareness. But it was real. It was the first brick in the foundation of a new relationship, one built not on obligation and assumption, but on mutual respect and a deeper, more honest understanding." "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. "We're all learning." We talked for a little while longer, the tension gone, replaced by a new, tentative openness. She asked me about my favorite painting in the Uffizi, and she really listened to the answer. It was a small thing, but it was everything. Reconnection wasn't about them welcoming me back into my old role. It was about them making space for the new woman I was becoming, a woman who had her own life, her own dreams, and her own terms. Returning home was a strange experience. The flight back across the Atlantic was not a retreat, but a strategic advance. I was not the same woman who had left 10 days prior, and I knew my home could not remain the same either. The moment I stepped through the front door, I felt the change. The house no longer felt like a cage or a shrine to my family, it felt like a canvas. My canvas. Sarah and Mark and Lily were there to greet me. The hug I received from my daughter was different. It was not the perfunctory peck of a busy woman, but a real embrace, one that held a new, fragile understanding. They had cleaned the house, and a vase of fresh flowers, roses, I noted with a wry smile, sat on the kitchen table. It was a peace offering. The days that followed were a delicate dance of renegotiation. The old patterns of behavior were deeply ingrained, And they didn't disappear overnight. There were moments when Sarah would start to say, "Mom, can you?" and then catch herself, a look of awareness crossing her face. I didn't gloat or say "I told you so." I simply waited, allowing her the space to correct her own course. My biggest act of reclamation was in the house itself. One afternoon, I went through the living room and took down half of the pictures of them from the mantelpiece. I replaced them with things that represented me. A beautiful print of Botticelli's Venus that I had bought in Florence. A small, lopsided pot from my pottery class, which I now saw as a symbol of beautiful imperfection. A framed photo of the laughing woman on the Amalfi Coast, me. When Sarah came home and saw the changes, she stopped in her tracks. I held my breath, waiting for the protest. But she just looked at the new arrangement for a long moment and then said, "It looks nice, Mom. It looks like you." The ultimate test of our new dynamic came a few weeks later. Mark's sister was getting married out of state, and they were planning to be gone for a long weekend. The old assumption would have been that I would provide wall-to-wall coverage for Lily. Sarah approached the topic with a new, hesitant respect. "Mom," she started, "we have to go to Stephanie's wedding next month. We were wondering. What are your plans for that weekend?" The question was a gift. It acknowledged that I had a life, that my time was my own. "Well," I said, pulling out a calendar I now kept, filled with my own appointments, pottery class, coffee with Eleanor, a lecture at the museum. I have my pottery class on Saturday morning. But I'm free Saturday afternoon and evening if you'd like Lily to have a sleepover with her grandma." Sarah's face broke into a relieved smile. "That would be wonderful," she said. "Thank you." We had found a new way. It wasn't about me withdrawing my love or support. It was about me offering it from a place of choice, not obligation. My love was no longer a utility, it was a gift, and it was treated as such. In finding my own self-worth, I had paradoxically become more valuable to them. They saw me now not as a convenience, but as a person, a woman with her own rich, interesting life that they were privileged to be a part of. They started asking about my interests, listening to my stories. Lily, in particular, was fascinated by my trip. She would sit with me for hours, looking at my sketchbook, asking me to tell her the stories behind my drawings of Italian fountains and stray cats. I was no longer just the grandma who baked cookies, I was the grandma who had been to Rome. The true reward, however, was internal. My happiness was no longer a fragile thing, dependent on their moods or their approval. It was a deep, steady wellspring within me, fed by my own choices, my own passions, my own adventures. I had found a profound peace in my own company. The quiet of my house was no longer a lonely silence, it was a welcome tranquility, a space where I could think, and read, and draw. My life was my own creation. The final scene of this chapter of my life unfolded a few months later. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the family was gathered at my house for dinner. The dynamic was completely transformed. I was not in the kitchen, frantically trying to get everything on the table while they relaxed in the living room. We had cooked together, a chaotic but joyful collaboration. Now, we were all sitting around the oak table, and I was telling them about the new trip I was planning, a river cruise down the Danube. "They have lectures on the history and the art of the region right on the boat," I explained, my eyes shining with excitement. "And Vienna. I've always wanted to see Klimt's The Kiss in person." Instead of the worried, dismissive looks I would have gotten before, I saw only interest and support. Mark asked about the itinerary. Sarah wanted to see the brochure. Lily announced that when she was old enough, she wanted to be an adventurer just like Grandma. I looked around the table at my family, at the love and respect in their eyes, and my heart was full. But my happiness was not contingent on their presence. They were a beautiful, wonderful part of my life, but they were not the whole of it. After they had gone home, leaving the familiar, happy mess of a shared meal behind, I sat in my quiet living room. The mantelpiece was a perfect reflection of my new reality, a picture of my laughing granddaughter next to a sketch I had made in a Florentine piazza. A photo of my daughter and her husband next to my lopsided, beloved pot. It was a life of connection and independence, of family and self. I picked up the brochure for the Danube cruise and smiled. The journey was not over. It was just beginning. I had set my boundaries, and in doing so, had found not just freedom, but a deeper, more authentic connection to the people I loved. And I had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that choosing yourself is the greatest adventure you can ever take. I had reclaimed my life, not by pushing others away, but by finally, lovingly, making room for myself. The woman who had been a discarded heart was now whole, and free.